recorded it as well, talking about, the meaning of sunrise. And he couldn't be with us live. And then other people appeared, and we got, a discussion going. And then it was the turn for a talk by an amazing man from South Africa called Dean Liprini, who is a sort of, he's a kind of, a Druid, I would call him. He's a very wise man who's from Cape Town, and he spent a lot of time exploring the sacred sites around Cape Town, particularly Table Mountain. And he's discovered these alignment points connected with the setting and the rising of the sun, particularly at the solstices. And there's one in particular called the dolmen, where the rising sun seems to come through in perfect alignment. And he's studied with Credo Mutwa, a Sangoma of much esteem, who unfortunately died recently. And he's studied with local people who have carried on an oral tradition about these sites in South Africa. And he talked us through them. He showed us maps, pictures, little video clips. What's very interesting is that archaeologists have discovered in that part of South Africa caves with some of the earliest cave art or cave painting, symbolic painting ever in world history. There's one called the Blombosch Cave, I think. And they found these red ochre tablets which have crisscrossed hatch markings on. Now, Dean has interpreted this as being pathways tracking the sun during the solar year. And he found that if you do track the points of equinox and solstices on what he calls the far horizon of the bay at Cape Town, then you get the same cross-hatching effect. So it was a tour de force, I think, Dean's work, coming from the heart but also the mind. And it turns out he also has been to a cave, which I knew about, not too far from there, where there's a python engraved, and it's a naturally occurring rock that looks like a python, but it's been scratched and marked further to make it look like scales. And a Norwegian archaeologist has recently there discovered votive offerings at the head of the python in the form of arrowheads, over a 70,000 year period, meaning there was some kind of ritual or ceremony going on in this cave dedicated to the python deity for 70,000 years. And it's the oldest continuously inhabited ritual religious site in human history anywhere in the world. Now, I knew about that as a teacher of religious studies. Dean didn't quite know how I knew about it, and I didn't know that he knew about it. So we had an interesting, part of the talk where he was showing us photographs from it. And in fact, he's writing a paper about this at the moment, because he's been privy to enough inside oral knowledge that's handed down by the local people that he can now interpret some of the markings and things. He works from a mixture of spirit and guidance and academic intellectual research, which is kind of how I work. And he's published a book called Pathways of the Sun, which he showed us parts of. So Dean gave a brilliant talk, and that was superb, coming just after sunrise. Then we went on to the next speaker, Marko Hren, who is a kind of Dean Liprini, but from Slovenia. Marko I've met several times in India and in Slovenia. And we met first through my respect and working with the Jain community in India, when they've invited me to help participate in conferences on non-violence. Marko turned up there, and he has been going to Jain conferences. He knew Acharya Tulsi, a great Jain, who was a colleague and inspiration for me as well. And so when Mark and I met, he was giving a talk about spirituality and peace. And I just knew that we were like blood brothers from ancient times. and we've stayed friends ever since. Most recently, I saw him in Cobb last year. I gave a talk at a conference on the pagan roots of Slovenian folk culture, really. They've discovered in Slovenia that there was a living tradition of paganism that survived Christianization. It survived the persecution of paganism by Christians. It survived the scientific kind of poo-pooing of spirituality. It survived the communist era when religion was looked on with some approbation. And anthropologists have discovered that there was a whole living, vibrant tradition of paganism in the Slovenian mountains, around Kobarid and elsewhere in the Socha River Valley. And so Marco set up a group called Upashena, which is to revive this tradition. And it's working with anthropologists, scientists, but also with local people. They organised a conference there last year, which I was invited to speak about Druidry and peace in Europe. And I met some fascinating people through that. And so Marco joined us from Slovenia. The day before, he'd been at a pagan solstice gathering near Triglav, which is the highest mountain in Slovenia, which is named after the three peaks. And one of the themes that Marco's been exploring is the recurrence of threeness in Slovenian sacred architecture and topography. Seems they like to do things in threes. Dean commented that actually that's a feature of the ancient South African culture as well. The triangle, it's a pretty fundamental shape, if you want, for early mankind to explore and discover. So Marco spoke very movingly about from a Slovenian pagan perspective, how peace can be achieved, how peace can be built in this world. He works partly with the European Union, he works with sustainability and development issues, and he works with how we can transform the economy so that it's sustainable, so that we, our children, our children's children, our grandchildren down the line can all have a good quality of life and live in harmony with nature, with the landscape, with the sacred, and with the and with access to the full wisdom traditions of humanity. The point of Marx and the communist critique of capitalism was that it divides us up into little knowledge ants. We all do our little thing. We learn to do one machine and we do that for years. Whereas our true heritage as human beings is to be hunter-gatherers, which is what we were for 1 million years. And the people that built the sites in South Africa, they were hunter-gatherers, right? Had a knowledge of the plants, the local animals and so on. And so Marco is looking to a way of rekindling that ancient wisdom, that ancient gnosis, if you want, to bring it forward into today. What new vision of spirituality do we want as Europeans or British or Irish or Slovenian or world citizens? It has to be a sustainable spirituality. Can't be a spirituality that, there's one God up there dominating everyone, and if you're bad, you get zapped. I mean, that's a very primitive concept, and we need to move beyond that. We've had an enlightenment since the Middle Ages. Some people are still stuck in that. I don't believe that was ever the intention of Abraham or Moses or Jesus or Muhammad or any of the great seers. Any true seer knows that model is just for kids. Right, so then we come to our next talk, which was very interesting. And this was Chris Busby, a scientist, an ecologist, who spoke about the need for the greening of science, really. He's been an eco-scientist for many years. And he set up a company called Green Audit. He's been giving advice, including legal advice and scientific advice, to citizens groups campaigning against nuclear radiation pollution in their environment. And he's conducted a lot of very technical tests on the effects of so-called low-level radiation. So leakages from Sellafield in Cumbria and other places where Britain's nuclear power is generated, some of it, and where nuclear weapons are manufactured, also in the factories and so on. How is this radiation then getting out into the environment, and what's the damage it's doing? Well, Chris knows about the details of this. He can measure it. He has the equipment. He has a scientific background. And he knows that this so-called safe radiation is not safe at all. It's very dangerous. It causes cancer. He can show the statistics of that. And he's been a witness in courts in Britain, in trials about this many times. He made a very hard-hitting documentary a few years ago with, I think, a largely Dutch or German television company. The British government, in its folly, had been dumping so-called low-level nuclear waste in steel barrels into the Irish Sea and the English Channel for decades, in a secret programme that was never, openly admitted to, and which had never been properly diagnosed. What was the implications of this? Chris got some divers to go down, and they found these barrels are now rusting at the base of the North Sea or the English Channel, just off Jersey. And the sludge, which is still radioactive and will be for millennia, is now washing up onto the beaches of Jersey and other bathers' paradise places. And Chris has been along with his instruments, measured the impact, and yes, these have now reached dangerous levels. This is cancer-producing levels of radiation on the beaches of resorts in Jersey and other islands. Now, this documentary, which I was appalled when I watched it, has been banned from the UK. You can't see it on YouTube in the UK. I don't know how they've got the technology to do that, but it's banned. But here in Europe, you can watch it. And so I'm in awe of Chris's braveness and his courage in exposing not just the nuclear energy industry's failings, but also the nuclear weapons industry. They're interconnected. So as I asked him, are you against nuclear weapons? Yes. Are you against nuclear energy? Yes, because they're the same thing. You can't have one without the other. So we need to find a green energy source that is environmentally non-destructive. We need to move away from reliance on nuclear energy. Here in France, that's a big thing because the French like nuclear energy. They regard it as non-polluting to the carbon cycle and so on. Well, this is where the greening of science comes in. We need to think new ways of accessing energy, which are not harmful and polluting. So some really interesting conversations, and Chris also talked about the problem of science itself being value-free, ethically neutral. He's given papers and talks at conferences, and he keeps discovering really the fundamental bottom line argument from the scientific professionals who create all these things, like nuclear weapons and stuff, is, well, don't ask me about the ethics, I'm just a scientist. I don't do ethics. I just make the thing. I do the how, I'm not interested with the why. So Chris gave a more philosophical critique of why we got to this place where science thinks it's value-free. And in the documentary I watched, he goes to talk to ministers or underlings in the ministries of the British state and says, are you aware that your barrels are leaking out and going to cause cancer? And they say, well, that's nothing to do with me. I'm just a civil servant. And anyway, it's not true. If you're challenged scientifically, then the response is to lie, which I think is wrong. And that's why I proposed a bill of veracity in the UK Parliament, that all parliamentarians and civil servants should have to tell the truth on these very important matters. How can we clean up the world if people go on lying? The world has got into the state it's in because of lies. I don't want any more Chernobyls where a huge section of the Ukraine was rendered uninhabitable by this tragic accident. If that happened at Sellafield in Cumbria, which is very possible one day, or in France or wherever, no, we need to listen to people like Chris Busby. They're half scientist, half prophet, in my opinion. So he gave a brilliant talk. Then we moved on to an Indian woman who was speaking to us from Ajmer in Rajasthan, the seat of a famous Sufi. And she's a Jain called Bharti Jain, who has been active for many years in the peace-building community in India. She's working with a particular form of visualizations and empowerments, drawing on yoga. And by then it was Sunday morning, so we were into the International Day of Yoga, which seemed appropriate. And she gave a wonderful, discourse about the philosophical basis of peacemaking and ahimsa, and practical exercises, things you can do to empower and charge up your own sephirotic system, as the Kabbalists would call it, or your energy chakras, as the Hindus and Jains call it, or Buddhists. And Bharti's also helping the work of the World Intellectual Forum with the youth wing. And we've been working in December on getting a group of young people to think through how we can envisage a non-violent world together. And what's the role of intellect, what's the role of thought. So that's an important contribution. And then we moved on to Professor David Adams, who I think is a really important and significant figure, actually. I've known of David Adams' work for years. I once met him in UNESCO headquarters when he was working there in the 90s. David was a professor of science in, I think, Yale and Princeton. And he ended up working on what is it that triggers aggression in human beings? What chemicals, what nervous reactions? Why do people get so hyped up they'll kill each other? That then led him to look at the bigger picture question of, violence and why humans are violent. And somehow he got involved with a project. They had a meeting in Seville in Spain with Federico Mayor, who was another scientist, discussing the nature of violence in human beings. Is it inevitable? If so, we might as well pack up and stop doing peace studies, because we're just going to fight this one out. It's warriors all the way. But what David Adams and Federico Mayor and other experts discovered is that no, it is there. We all can be triggered into violence, but we can also be encultured out of it. If we have a certain training, a certain mental capacity, a certain intellectual depth, and we can access the culture and philosophical heritage of mankind, and we can study, Bible and teachings of Christ and Buddha and Mahavira and Krishna, we'll realize that actually there is this other thing, there's this culture of peace, which is more important than the culture of violence. Yeah, we can all become killers and train and become a great SS warrior or whatever, but actually that's just like kindergarten level. I used to play Cowboys and Indians when I was a kid, 7 or 8, running around Kemp Town. I was a great hero. I was El Cid, many times running around Sussex Square. And but you grow out of that, right? So, and you grow into appreciating the higher culture of humanity and the culture of peace. So David was given the job, working for UNESCO, to create a culture of peace as a project for humanity. At the moment, we are obsessed with war. We have a culture of war. Warriors sign up and go and attack Iraq, or train as drone operators that can drop bombs on Afghan weddings in the name of whatever, democracy, I don't know what they're doing in the name of. Or, that's the culture of war, that's glorification of war. Nowadays it's often cyber warfare, so you train and you post, nasty stuff on the internet against the enemy. That's they've invented a whole new field of warfare, psychological warfare. Well, what David was given the job to do at UNESCO, which is up the road in Paris, was, no, let's think through a culture of peace. And he explained to us in his talk, which was brilliant, you can watch it, that the team he was working with decided to approach it by looking at what are the components of a culture of war first. That's what we've got. There are things like authoritarianism, secrecy, control, top-down control, threats, bullying, fear, sort of bribery, like money, yeah, but only if, you kill this person or whatever. So, etc., etc. There's a sort of there's a package that comes with the culture of war. And then, and deceit is part of that, lying, the ability to lie for your country or whatever. So then, by contrast, they decided, well, what would a culture of peace look like? Well, it'd be kind of the mirror opposite. It would be about truth, it would be about mutual respect, it would be about circles instead of pyramids, it would be about egalitarian use of resources, sharing, cooperation, and so on and so on. So they developed this program. Now, the Culture of Peace project then went to the UN General Assembly. It was voted on and adopted, but in a watered-down format. And I thought, David was explaining something behind the scenes here. You see, the UN didn't like the idea of looking at the culture of war, because the UN, which is a body of nation states, is fundamentally wedded, actually, to, let's keep the nation state, that's fine. They can all be there with their armies, doing their stuff. We're just the kind of icing on the cake. We'll bring an international veneer to make it look good when they feel like it. So what he discovered was that his proposal had the entire section on the culture of war pulled out. That was like the teeth were pulled. And so the formula that was adopted in the UN General Assembly was very muted, watered down. So not only that, but then as he was working at UNESCO still, trying to get the thing then implemented, he realized people, the UN system of nation states is almost intellectually incapable of reforming itself from within, as long as it gives the absolute sovereign power over policy to national war leaders. So at the time he was trying to do all this, NATO was bombing Kosovo, and with the UN not really protesting. The UN wasn't, the UN has allowed the US, the UK, NATO to get away with murder for far too long during this whole sequence, since 9/11 really, since the invasion of Iraq, but also before. Since 1990, when the Cold War ended, the Treaty of Paris, instead of actually having peace, we've allowed the drift to the culture of war to carry on. We had the whole Kosovo, we had the breakup of Yugoslavia. That should have been all prevented through the UN, through diplomacy, through mediation. Yugoslavia, in my opinion, should have been kept together and joined the European Union as one, federal state. That was not beyond the bounds of diplomacy. But I think the nation states, in a sense, they feed off war. It's a great opportunity for their bomb testing. And there aren't enough peace visionaries embedded in the civil service of the nation states. The European Union wasn't strong enough to really intervene, I think. I've been proposing it should set up a European Union mediation service, which I'm still working on. And then it would have a duty to intervene in things like Yugoslavia or Ukraine. But that's part of this shift from what David Adams talked about, a culture of war to a culture of peace. He told a very interesting anecdote in his talk, which I must share, which is, I found shocking but not unexpected. When he was working at UNESCO implementing the Culture of Peace program, he received backup support and help from all the heads of divisions at UNESCO. UNESCO is a great big bureaucracy of intellectuals. So the people working with culture and the arts, people working with poetry and literature, people working with education, and whether school or university level, people working with the humanities, history, all these people came along and supported the Culture of Peace project. They all said, great stuff. We're with you. What can we do? Should we help rewrite textbooks? The one group that wanted nothing to do with it were the scientists, the heads of the scientific divisions, the natural scientists. So much so was their non-cooperation that David eventually called a meeting for them. He said, look, it's ridiculous. Come along to this meeting in a committee room on such and such a day. And so all the heads of the scientific divisions at UNESCO came along, and David said, look, what are you doing about the culture of peace? Where's your contribution? And they all said, look, David, you're a great bloke, we love you, but actually, no, science has nothing to do with the culture of peace. We aren't going to play. And David trying to argue, like, hang on, of course it has to do with culture of peace. Like, I'm a scientist. I worked on, for instance, the neurological bases of aggression, the hormonal basis of aggression, the physiological changes that happen during fight and flight and aggression and so on, the pathology of murder and killing. You can also look at this zoologically. All animals fight to some extent, but they don't normally fight their own species apart from over mate selection, and they don't normally fight to the death. Why is it humans do this collective, aggregate mass killing? Well, okay, let's look at chimpanzees. They do something similar, as Jane Goodall has explored. Bands of males roam around the edge of the territory of a group of chimpanzees with sticks. And they do tend to get into tumbles and fights with other groups of chimpanzees doing the same, male ones. There's a chimpanzee gene in us that these males just like to roam about and do that. But we're also partly descended from the bonobo, and they don't. They are much more friendly. If they see strangers, they tend to make love and flirt. They're much more sexy than the chimps. Chimps reach for the sticks, the bonobos, have a cuddle and a kiss. We have both elements inside us. Well, here's something science should study. Actually, which bits do we inherit from which ancestors, and zoologically and anthropologically can we study? How can we get rid of that sort of chimpanzee-ness that these males want to go around killing? Well, in the chimps they don't actually kill, they just wave sticks and bare their teeth. Why do humans go the whole hog and kill each other and invent really sophisticated ways of doing it? I've been watching a scary but extraordinary film about the Nazi-Soviet war made for Russian television a couple of years ago, called Soviet Storm, and it shows the battles between the Nazi invading force of Operation Barbarossa with the Soviet defense and how they miraculously held the line. I mean, really, the Germans sort of won, but it's a combination of weather and sheer just dogged patience and persistence by the Soviets that they didn't lose. Well, watching it, it's shocking, and that's what our chimps do. I mean, Hitler was a complete idiot, warlord, who never did the SAGE training. He never completed it. And he thought it's in the interest of Germany to go and launch a mass slaughter campaign against the Soviet Union. I mean, completely daft. Von Stauffenberg, who tried to blow him up, said that's the last straw. Because also, the other thing Hitler did was he disallowed the Geneva Convention on the battle line. He said, we're not giving any rights to these Soviet troops. Most of them are Jews, they don't count. So that's a chimp gone mad, right? Well, where does that come from? Why do some people think that behaving like that is okay? And, Stalin was no little pussycat either. I mean, he'd been mass slaughtering his own people in the name of his ideology. Why do people do that? So, anyway, Adams tried to argue, look, we need science, we need anthropology, zoology, paleontology, neurology, biochemistry and so on. But no, the scientists weren't having it. No, nothing to do with us, mate. You could add that we need psychology because we need to understand the higher states of inner peace. How is it some people can attain enlightenment, wisdom like Buddha, whose sculpture I have behind me? How do some people transmute their negativity through meditation and prayer so the demons leave them alone, as Buddha did, or St. Anthony did, or Christ did? What are those kind of experiences? Why is it some people can, see off the demons of violence, hate, anger, etc., and other people fall victim to them? How can we help people out of those chaoses of despair that people get into with violence? And that's the job of transpersonal psychology and psychology generally. So yes, that's also needed. But no, the scientists weren't interested. No, nothing to do with us. So anyway, they then, and then Adams tried one final track. He said, look, a lot of scientists around the world are working for the military. They're misusing their knowledge. So even if you don't want to help positively, like scientists studying peace, at least scientists could be studying war a bit less. What if you guys took a sort of Hippocratic or Pythagorean oath not to do violence research, and that you would act ethically? You wouldn't make things that would blow people up or kill them or feed them dangerous microbes. You wouldn't do bioweapons research, nuclear weapons research, etc. And what if you took an oath that you'd give your duty as a scientist to humanity and the betterment and advancement of humanity and well-being of humanity above and beyond your duty to whatever corporation was paying you or military establishment? And that apparently most scientists now have to sign non-disclosure agreements with their employers, be it a government or a corporation. And so they're kind of a bit like prostitutes who give their knowledge to whatever corporation it is, and they won't share their knowledge with other bodies. So they're all operating under oaths of secrecy, effectively, just like military types. So what Adam said is, well, how about we challenged all that? We got a debate going where scientists have to work for peace as a priority. Anyway, at this point, the head of the science lot, he got up, he looked at Adam and said, I'm leaving, I'm off. And he walked out of the meeting, which was only like a third of the way in. And after he'd gone, every other scientist in the room, all of these people at the meeting, they all got up and walked out. And David was shocked, as I would have been. And he walked out after them, found them all in the corridor. And they said to him, look, off the record, David, that last thing you said there, that would mean that the scientific careers of 90% of active scientists would not be functional. If you require sort of ethics from us, and we can't sign non-disclosure agreements, and we can't enter the culture of military secrecy, we won't get jobs. We can't pay our mortgages. We're going to be very ethical, but we'll have no work to do. And that's why we can't be part of your program. A culture of peace threatens the very foundational elements of science, which is bound up with the culture of war, secrecy, militarism, and deceit. Anyway, David shared all this in his talk, and it was an eye-opener because these are matters I've thought about a great deal over the years as a philosopher and teacher and historian of science and peace, and I wrote about it in my doctoral thesis. So to hear that had happened in UNESCO, I thought it was very interesting. I was a bit perplexed he didn't immediately go to Federico Mayor, who was by then Secretary General of UNESCO, and get some authority, interposed onto the science heads at UNESCO, that they had to cooperate. I still think that Culture Peace Project should be brought back. David told us very tragically, soon after that, he was actually sacked from UNESCO without any rhyme or reason or justification. But one of the people that was appointed and who sacked him said, I've been sent here by country XYZ to sack you. He was totally open about it. In other words, the governments of the world didn't want the Culture of Peace program flourishing. Gosh, there might be peace education work going on in your school. Your kids might learn that bullying is not a good idea. Your kids might learn that actually taking knives around the streets is not a good idea. They might learn about human evolution and that we have a peace narrative. That most of our success has come about through cooperation, as Kropotkin said, not through violent confrontation, as the warmongers like to tell us. And that we shouldn't be spending